Hi, everyone. We want to welcome you to this wonderful event today, and thank you for coming to hear Dean Rachel Kyte. We're very excited to have everyone. We're sorry we could not do this in person, obviously, but we're very excited to have everyone from Tufts and Fletcher here to have the opportunity to hear from Dean Kyte and ask her some questions. My name is Corey Diamond. I'm the Senior Director of Development and Alumni Relations at the Fletcher School. And before we get to Dean Kyte, just a few housekeeping items. If you have questions for the Q&A, please just enter them in the Q&A box on your screen. I will read them in the order that they are received when we get to that portion of the event. Also, just a reminder, right after this, we will have a separate event for Fletcher alumni to hear from and talk with Dean Kyte further this morning. You will need to log off of this event and then log in using the link for that event that you should have received. And that will start at about 9:05. Before we get to Dean Kyte, I would just like to introduce our special guest who will be introducing Dean Kyte, Dr. Courtney Fung, who graduated from Fletcher with a PhD and who is now an assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong. And she is here to introduce Dean Kyte. Thank you, Courtney, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Corey. Whoops, let's move this one. Thanks so much, Corey, and thank you everyone for coming to join us today. It is my absolute honor to introduce Dean Rachel Kyte, who is the 14th Dean of the Fletcher School and the first woman to lead our community. Dean Kyte has been in this role since October of 2019, and she herself is a 2002 GMAP graduate and has been a professor of practice at Fletcher since 2012. Most recently, before joining Fletcher, Dean Kyte was the CEO of Sustainable Energy for All, a non-profit public-private platform created by the UN to promote and finance clean, affordable energy and low carbon growth. Dean Kyte was recently invited by the Secretary General of the United Nations as a member of the High-Level Advisory Group for Climate Action Strategy, and just last week, she testified before the US House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Subcommittee hearing on green recovery plans for the COVID crisis. So a perfect lead up to the topic of discussion today. Prior to Sustainable Energy for All, Dean Kyte served as the World Bank Group's Vice President and Special Envoy for Climate Change, leading all of the Bank Group's campaign for an ambitious agreement to the UN 2015 Climate Change Conference in Paris. It is very clear that Dean Kyte has been a leading advocate for sustainable development while focusing on affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy as the key means to combat poverty and climate change. And so we are so honored to have this opportunity to spend time with her today. And so with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dean Kyte. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Courtney, for that very kind introduction. And I am delighted to be speaking to you all today. And so good evening, good afternoon from the Boston area. As Courtney said, I've been the Dean for almost a year. I didn't plan for the second half of it to be quite as complicated as it has been with the COVID crisis. But I am deeply honored to be in this position at this time. So what I'm going to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about the challenge we face as a result of the COVID crisis, as it pertains to how we think about resilience and our resilience to other crises which are coming to us. It's funny for me to think back when I was involved in the search process for the new dean. When I threw my hat into the ring, as is traditional, you're asked to write a sort of essay about your vision for the school. And in my attempt to explain the leadership that I would bring, I talked about some of the challenges that the world was facing and would face for the time that any new dean would be at the school, and I talked about a series of existential and non-existential crises that I felt that Fletcher needed to teach throughout its curriculum. I talked about nuclear proliferation. I talked about climate change. I talked about cyber threats. And I talked about zoonotic pandemic diseases. I didn't want to be right in the way that COVID-19 has illuminated our lack of resilience and strain on the international system. But it's been there is no crisis without an opportunity, and in my work in support of the Secretary General, the United Nations, my work in plotting through the principles around which we need to found our recovery, and I'm chairing a group working on the financial principles for green recovery at the moment. So my work beyond running the school, we have to find ways to take what is a crisis and turn it into opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen now. I've got a few slides. Just want to walk you through some of the ways that we can understand these compound crises, right? They're happening at the same time. We are in the middle of a climate crisis. COVID-19 has dislocated supply chains and value chains around the world. It has touched almost every country. So let me try and share my slides and hope that this works. So what are we learning in this time of COVID-19, which is important for the way in which the world responds to very present climate impacts? Well, first of all, this isn't about emissions, but it is about inequality and what inequality means for resilience. When we're negotiating climate progress, when we're negotiating an international regime focused on combating climate change, there are two pieces of the puzzle. One is emissions reduction and the ability to mitigate climate change. The second is our adaptation to a world changed by climate and our need to build resilience. We've learned a lot about our irresilience in the past 6 months. The lack of resilience in parts of the energy system around the world, the lack of resilience in our food systems in large parts of the world, the lack of resilience within communities. You can't self-isolate from a virus. You can't self-isolate from a warming world either. And so there is some very interesting observations around shift in social norms, shift in public attitudes, but also policymakers focus on the fact that we have learned a lot about our resilience or lack of it in the last 6 months. In some societies, we're learning a lot about our relationship to science. What do you think about science? How do you base policy on science? How do you refute science? Is science refuted by policymakers? And then how do you build really good relationships between science and policymakers? How do you deal with scientific debate and discourse and disagreement when you're in a policy making? Now, for those of us who've worked on climate for 20, 25 years, some of the debates that we're seeing around COVID scientific advice are not new. So, unless every single scientist agrees on a single point of climate change observation, then science is not agreed, and therefore we should ignore it. We're seeing some of the same debates in some societies around science with COVID. Traditional modes of cooperation are at least strained, if not broken. The challenges to the World Health Organization, the fact that it took 6 months almost for the Security Council to discuss COVID-19, the problems with debt service packages and their adequacy at the IMF have brought to the forefront some of the strains of the traditional multilateral system. And the need for more solidarity rather than less at a time when key international partners that would normally be galvanizing the G7, the G20 and other economic decision-making bodies or leadership bodies, the fact that a sort of viral brand of populism, both from the left and the right, the fact that that is impacting on the way in which we would normally cooperate and build solidarity in a time of crisis is also important. But what I think is really interesting is that we were warned. We were warned very articulately. Exactly this week, a year ago, the Global Monitoring Body, which had been established by the World Health Organization and the World Bank in response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2014, 2016, explicitly said that the world was at risk and individual countries were at risk from a respiratory zoonotic pandemic outbreak, and described COVID-19 with great clarity. And that report landed on people's desks and stayed on people's desks. So it's interesting to think about the climate crisis, which is barreling towards us just as COVID barreled towards us, and what it is about our systems and what it is about our governance that means that we don't necessarily react. This is a concept put forward by Michelle Wooker just a few years ago, and she called it a grey rhino. So at the beginning of the COVID crisis, as the economic impacts started to be felt, a lot of people compared this crisis then to the most recent one. So people look back to 2008, 2009, and to the great financial crisis of this time. That was tellingly described at the time by Nassim Taleb as a black swan. So it was a crisis that was only really visible to the vast majority of people in a rear view mirror. And it seemed to be an extraordinary, improbable and unpredictable event, although there were a few people who did see it coming. In this case, COVID-19 and the climate crisis are not black swans, they are grey rhinos. They are large, they are dangerous, they are in many ways calculable risks, and they are in full view. And yet, as society, as decision makers, as governments, we have been slow to acknowledge, slow to respond, slow to really understand the impact, and slow to work together to obviate the risk. And so it is important, I think, to use this concept of a grey rhino in policy making and work out why it is, when there is such an obvious danger, we respond so quickly. So we don't respond so quickly. There's another way to think about this crisis, which is that, as I said, it's brought real strain to the current system. But as in every crisis, there is an opportunity. And the opportunity here is both to respond in the short term, to try to find a way to manage through the pandemic as best we can, but to manage through the pandemic in a way that prepares us and builds our resilience to the crises which are already coming fast towards us. But I think there's a higher question now, which a number of governments and international organizations are struggling with, which is this a moment where we actually can reset? So if we think about the economic debate prior to COVID, there were two major sort of disruptive factors that were being discussed. The IMF had used the platform, the World Economic Forum in January, to really push forward its deep concerns about the impact of inequality on growth, inequality within countries and inequality between. In fact, over the last 20 years, inequality between countries had been narrowing, but inequality within countries was growing. And they brought forward a series of very telling data points to really discuss how that was going to impact growth and make for problems within economies. At the same time, there was a growing concern around the impact of climate change on the ability to continue to grow and develop. And so now, if we think about inequality and we think about carbon as two things that we want to have less of in the economy, in our global economy, less of in our society, then how do we use this moment to build back economic systems that will support us to be resilient in the teeth of the crisis, so jobs, job-rich growth, income levels, etc., but also that put us on a pathway to a less carbon-intensive and a more equal economic future. So we need scaffolding. We have to put scaffold around the current system so that it can get us through the next few months and years. So that's, for example, the conversation around health governance within the WHO and improvement of the WHO. That's, for example, the discussion around debt service agreement within the IMF and the ability for the IMF to be able to meet the needs of more than 94 countries who've asked for help. But then is there space for scholarship or for blue sky thinking or some planning that would put us on a slightly different trajectory going forward? So that would be, do we need to have new architecture for international health governance? Do we need to have new financial architecture that could perhaps deal with both an incredible level of indebtedness and the need to support countries to decarbonize at the same time? So for example, when we talk about financial system scaffolding, can the annual meetings of the IMF move forward in agreement on SDR issue? This is a new special drawing rights issue. Is that possible to do before November the 3rd, or do we have to wait until after November the 3rd? And would a potential Biden government take a different view than the Trump administration on this? Can we put additional capital into the international system to help it support countries with their growth? Is there a way to deal with debt and the amounts of debt that will come from recovery packages in new and creative ways? Are there ways in which to increase the amount of bond issues without imperiling the economic system? But the scholarship opportunity is an opportunity for redesign. Is there something to be done by looking at instruments that would both write off debt and support governments to decarbonize at the same time? There's work going on in 3 or 4 different places in the world now in detail on a potential generation of climate for debt swaps. Is there a way to reset the actual governance of the international financial system? Could we put different KPIs into the international financial system? What does that mean for GDP? Which is a very blunt instrument in measuring success, in that it neither includes the externalities of the impact on the environment, nor does it really measure welfare in terms of investments in health and education. Can we regulate banks for their original purpose? And this would mean that some of the new waves of banking regulation that will come in around transparency in terms of holding carbon as a negative asset, what is the future of that? What do we look at in terms of who sits around the table? If you go back to my example of a climate for debt swap, traditionally debt management would be a table which was laid for the countries which have borrowed, the Paris Club or the London Club, so sovereign lenders and private lenders, and perhaps the IMF and other institutions around the table. But if we were really to take a bold step to try to solve for both the indebtedness crisis and the climate crisis around the table today, we would have to have the traditional Paris Club donors, but we would have to have China and India. We would have to have traditional banks, but we would also have to have private equity. And we would have to have perhaps other actors around the table too. So can we solve for the problems of the future using the mechanisms and the governance of the past? So we are at this point in time still, I think, in many countries stuck in the relief phase. You're seeing new waves of packages coming forward, which are just intended to put a band-aid over what is the hemorrhaging of growth within economies and really pressuring certain sectors of the industry and the economy into very negative situations. But we are seeing, especially in developed economies, the emergence of recovery plans. And as Mohamed El-Arian said, the risk here is if you go too fast, you, in terms of recovery plans for the economy, you risk from dying from infection. If you go too slow, you risk dying from from the impact of the economic downturn. But where we're starting to see certain countries now is emerging is into the rebalance of health and economic risks. So they're going from relief to planning for recovery to actually articulating some aspect of redesign or reset or rebalance. And in fact, the Japanese government has put up a website which is tracking all of the recovery packages in terms of those 3 phases and is looking for sustainability in that 3rd phase. So there is an opportunity, and we're beginning to see, as countries are able to think about the medium term while they're dealing with the short-term risk of COVID, we're starting to see some interesting discussion. First of all, there is violent agreement amongst economists around the world, the OECD, the IMF, the multilateral development banks, the International Energy Agency in the case of energy, around the fact that there are sweet spots, that there are items that should be in the forefront of relief and recovery packages that will stimulate jobs in the short term, will produce income growth in the short to medium term, and which will reduce emissions aggressively for the long run. So this could be, these are packages which could help you pivot towards a trajectory of lower carbon growth and more inclusion in the economy. In the energy sector, these are identified as creating jobs for deep refurbishment of the built environment, creating jobs in the resilience investments of power grids, and also the opportunities that come from the greening of transportation networks, not just supporting the car industry into electric vehicles, which of course China is leading the way, but also investments into public transportation and multimodal systems. But despite the fact that these sweet spots exist, the OECD's tracking and the tracking done by the University of Oxford and others would show that about 10% of stimulus to date is actually green. So there is still enormous room for improvement. At the same time, we're seeing a small number of countries submitting ratcheted up plans to the climate talks. This is the year that countries are supposed to come with a re-upped ambition 5 years after the Paris Agreement. And for some countries, in those plans which are being filed with the UN right now, you're starting to see the use of the recovery planning and this infusion of public cash that's going on around the world into speeding up their energy transitions. One very good example of this would be Chile, which has looked at its capacity through extraordinary renewable energy endowment. They have some of the best solar in the world, for example, some of the best wind and hydro in the world, that they could actually become a net exporter of green hydrogen. This is hydrogen that is generated but using renewable energy. And that this would be a big part of the stimulus and a big part of their meeting their goals under the Paris Agreement. The European Union remains the sort of talisman of green recovery. It announced a Green Deal at the end of last year, and then through the first half of this year came out with much more detail about how this would work in different sectors of the economy. But then in July came forward with its recovery package, which was about a $2 trillion recovery package, and about $600 billion of that was specific green elements of recovery, with knock-on effects for other sectors of the economy. And so this was everything from refurbishment of buildings to investment in green transportation, to investment in energy efficiency and renewable energy, to the beginning to restoration of landscapes. Now, of course, in terms of climate change, climate diplomacy got a shot in the arm last week with President Xi Jinping's announcement on Tuesday at the high-level segment of a commitment by China to a net zero economy by 2060, and an indication that China would hope to peak its emissions at 2030 or before. For those of us who watch China on climate change, we hope once again that this will be an example of under-promising and over-delivering. But I think what has been most interesting is the economic analysis of that announcement, which would indicate that in order to invest in the domestic economy so that it could reach net zero by 2060, we're looking at a 5% GDP growth through the course of the 2020s for the next decade. So China is making a bet that this is the way for it to grow its economy. With the European Union and China now with ambitious goals, the European Union is that it would reach by 2030 55% reductions over 1990 levels. Two of the three biggest actors in climate change have decided to join a race to the top, which leaves the United States on the eve of the first presidential debate in a quandary, in that this election poses a stark contrast for voters. Whether or not this is the number one item for those voters, they have two candidates, one of which would like to join the race to the top with a $2 trillion commitment by President Biden of his climate package, and President Trump still adhering to a position where he believes that agreement to reduce emissions actually penalizes the US economy. There are other interesting things to look for in Asia. The Koreans restated this week their principled commitment to bold climate action, but these are principled commitments, these are not binding, and the world is looking, I think, for a binding commitment from Korea. They're also looking to China, Korea, and Japan to stop funding coal-fired power in particular, but other fossil-fueled industries in other parts of the world where the transition is not yet underway with such speed and vitality. All eyes will be on the new Japanese leadership as well to see how Japan joins the race to the top with even more ambition. So there are implications for today's policymakers of understanding the impacts of COVID on our systems and on the irresilience that we've seen. First of all, the energy transition is underway, and there's a sense of urgency about giving it a nudge. And speaking to one of the to leading bankers last year in the margins of the General Assembly, I was struck by how many of them indicated that they believed that COVID had probably sped up by almost a decade financial attitudes to the energy transition. And so they were seeing a doubling down and a speeding up and perhaps a reaching of tipping points in how to finance the energy sector. And we've seen just in the last 48 hours a number of very important financial decisions over large scale energy infrastructure, which would indicate that that might be true. We can see that systems change is a big issue. COVID has sort of revealed the lack of resilience in some of the old systems and an opportunity to start to invest in those that we will need for the next 20 to 30 years. I think COVID asks big questions about international cooperation, not just the large-scale multilateral cooperation, but much of our resilience will come from regional agreements, regional power pools, ability to trade in, for example, here in Massachusetts, we have a potential energy market from the east of Canada and New England, and yet that has been elusive in recent years. And I think what COVID has done is really, for many policymakers, underlined that the price of inaction is much higher than the price of action. And so it's a question of finding the leadership which is prepared to take some big bets on decarbonisation and on measures to build resilience for the most vulnerable. As I said, you cannot self-isolate from inequality or from climate change. So from an international systems perspective, are we good enough really to seize the opportunity of systems reset? We are at a moment of, in great power theory, we are at a moment of maximum risk where one power is ascending and another may be in decline. So in that moment of chaotic tension, who would you put around the table to, for example, imagine a new Bretton Woods? Who would need to be there? With what agenda? Are we good enough to create the spaces where some of the diplomacy around this could happen? President Macron tried this in the spring and was rebuffed. This did not happen in the margins of the Security Council over the last 10 days. Where does the diplomacy for this come from? With the UK taking over the G7 for next year and Italy taking over G20, there is furious European diplomacy about whether or not this next year is a moment when we can bring economic policymaking and climate policymaking together, because both the UK and Italy will also chair the climate talks scheduled for November next year. So is this a moment, and is Boris Johnson big enough for this moment? These are questions being asked both in climate policy but in economic policymaking at the moment. So the leadership challenge for today is Can we stand in the path of the grey rhino and not blink? Can we use this opportunity not only to fashion recovery that actually protects us from the virus, the international cooperation needed for us to be able to protect everybody, because only then can we be protected? Or can we use this moment to actually look up, look beyond, and build using cathedral thinking, right? Build for something that we may not benefit from for ourselves, but which will surely benefit our children and our grandchildren. And what kind of leadership does it take to be able to do that? It's been interesting to watch the surveys on social trust over the last 7 months during COVID-19, and to see that those leaders who are capable of building social trust and who enjoy high levels of social trust within societies have been perhaps better able to steer through the crisis. What does that mean for climate change? Although they are small economies, the leaders of Finland, of Denmark, of New Zealand have shown that it is possible to stand up in front of your people and say, we don't know everything about this virus, or we don't know everything about our path to zero net emissions by 2040. But we are sure that together, using the ingenuity of our private sector, using partnerships and international solidarity, and using our own government and community capabilities, we will succeed. So Jacinda Ardern, it will be interesting to see whether or not in the election coming up, whether or not the people return her for having said that. It's interesting to watch both Denmark and Finland, where their leaders have said that as well. And it's interesting to note that all three are fairly young and all three are women. And so what do we know about leadership in building social trust? And what can we see in those kinds of leaders that we need to replicate elsewhere in the world? So this is 64,000 feet. There are many, many things that we could look at in terms of the relationship between the COVID crisis and the climate crisis. But I thought that I would just open up with some provocative ideas and hopefully have an interesting discussion with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dean Kyte. We have a few questions, so we'll jump right in. The first one is 2 parts. Do you see the green recovery to be mostly top-down, driven by policy, regulation, and multilateral institutions? How much confidence do you have in the private sector playing an active role post-COVID?
So that's a really excellent question from anonymous attendee. So I'm sorry, I can't see your name. I have a whole sort of different set of lecture notes and speaking notes on what's happening to the private sector. So I think it has been interesting to see that through the crisis, in a number of key sectors in the economy and in a number of key markets, private sector leaders have spoken out quite vociferously and asked for public policy that would double down on or create a pathway in the direction of travel which is already established. So that they've been asking for government ambition really around certainly around decarbonisation. So you've seen and you've also seen some major sort of reappraisal, I think, going on from a number of financial actors around the sort of health and longevity of certain companies within parts of the economy that were going to be a smaller part of the future than not. So obviously, within the coal, oil, and gas sector, we've seen a number of announcements by leading companies of their intention to become energy companies, or as I call them, carbon molecule management companies. And you've seen them doing okay, although I have to say BP, who are one of the leaders in this, their share price was under real pressure last week. But you're definitely seeing leaders sort of breaking for the hills and doubling down on decarbonisation, and laggards really struggling. You're seeing real struggling going on within the shale gas sector, for example, in the US, and you're seeing demands for large amounts of public bailout. In some of the financial principles that have been, so where public policy and private sector meet is that within the public policy discussion, both internationally and nationally, the question is, would you use public money to subsidize a company that you don't expect to be successful at the other end of this decade, and you're starting to see certainly some conditionality being introduced by different countries, particularly in Europe, but not only, around performance when it comes to decarbonisation from some of the companies that would be bailed out. You're seeing that in the airline sector. You're seeing that in other sectors of the economy. But I think the other thing is that there is, I think, local pressure. So resilience is understood locally. If you can't get access to fresh food, if you at affordable prices, if you can't get access to safe public transport, if you can't get access to affordable electricity from a system that is resilient, then that becomes very personal. And I think you've seen certainly in a number of countries the complete dislocation of food systems. Certainly in March, April, and May, you've seen an understanding that the food systems around the world are extremely brittle. I'll give you an example from the United States. When the restaurant industry closed down in sort of March and April, so the demand for liquid eggs disappeared. And yet everybody who was now cooking at home, right, those who could afford to buy food, were looking for round eggs. But the egg supply chain in the United States is built for one purpose or the other. So you've got factories that can only process liquid eggs that buy from farms that are producing for and these two things were not able to there was no flexibility within those systems. And so, factories were shuttered, farms were in real extremis. So that's just one tiny anecdote of the brittleness of some of the global supply chains. And I think that therefore, having local work as well as global, so glocal, right, has become something that policymakers are paying much more attention to. But the private sector, I think, can see the direction of travel. They know that carbon is an asset, as it were, whose value has got a question mark over it. And that value is actually decreasing in some parts of the world faster than others. And so we haven't seen an abandonment of the private sector goals and targets around decarbonisation. In fact, we've seen more and more companies committing to them.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what about the developing world? Should they breathe clean air in the dark for the next decades?
No, absolutely not. And I think the good news is that for 2/3 of the world population, for new installation of energy, renewable energy is a lot cheaper than fossil fueled energy. So it depends on where you are, and it depends on the existing power mix within the country. I spent much of my time over the last 5 years working on the 16 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that represent 80% of the energy access gap, right? So these are countries that have, perhaps only 5 to 10% of their populations with access to energy. And then if you start thinking about reliable and affordable energy, then even more people don't have access. And in those countries, the question is really about making sure that the finance flows to allow them to exploit their renewable energy resources alongside what they've already got installed. If you're living beyond or below the power grid, then decentralized renewable energy is by far the most cost-effective option for you. And waiting for a newly installed coal-fired power plant to be built somewhere outside the capital, and that somehow that's going to emerge through 40% of transmission losses in your grid and then eventually reach you when it hasn't reached you for the last 50 years, that's not really a winning proposition anymore. And I think that you don't see countries asking for those deals, and you don't see those deals really being invested in now. Of course, a lot of investment capital is moving away from those deals, and now we saw last week the first Asian insurer now saying it will not insure any more coal. So I think that at the point where insurers start walking away, then the industry really is on its last legs. The question of gas and how short or long a bridge that is to much more renewable energy in the mix, I think is important. And from an Asian perspective, will be critical. But in terms of the kind of energy mix that's possible, the decrease in the price of storage, as well as the decreases in the price of modern renewables, there's some fairly big bets being made by countries, including China. China cannot get to 2060 and be carbon and be net zero carbon without doubling down on both storage capability and on efficiency and on renewables. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think you it can't switch the lights on unless it's dirty energy. I think that's not the exam question that people are trying to answer now, and I don't think that we have to impoverish people in order to have clean air.
Great, thank you. The next question is, do you see a risk of a green funding bubble with so much drive towards sustainable investing, so few sources of returns, and so much capital looking to be deployed?
I don't know if a bubble is a problem. I think that it's clear that there is so it's clear that there's, as you point out, again, anonymous attendee, there's a big shift, and I think some observers would say that we're at the tipping point now. So I think that the number that is in my head is, which is a number which is about 9 months old, is that there's been a 22,000% increase in the amount of assets under management that are seeking to not be invested in fossil fuels. The number in the run-up to the Paris Agreement was about 54 billion of institutional assets, so pension funds, long-term investments, etc. Long-term investors, for example, 54 billion was divested in the winter of 2014, and earlier this year we were at 11 trillion. So that there's a steady drumbeat and a steady move in that direction, and that's global. It isn't just Northwest Europe and some parts of North America. That is being led by the Japanese Public Pension Fund and other funds in Asia as well. So I think that isn't going to that's not going to slow down, because the calculation is there's no real alpha in holding carbon. You're about to see a new wave of central bank activity on this issue. So we already have what we call TCFD, right, which is the transparency of financial disclosures related to carbon, which is voluntary. That's going to be mandatory in Europe, but you're starting to see central bank governors who work together in a group called NGFS, which includes, for example, the Malaysian Central Bank and others. They are going to start asking that for banks who work in their areas of jurisdiction, that they will, for example, have to disclose up to 80% of their book value of assets, how much carbon they are holding in their portfolio. As soon as you do that, then you're going to have a conversation between banks and companies around carbon performance, as it were, at which point you'll start to see, I think, all kinds of opportunities for putting numbers on that as either as a distressed asset or as something that you need to be disclosing. So I think that you're going to start to see financial engineering on the financial side around the fact that carbon is something that nobody really wants to be holding so much anymore. I think that asks big questions of central bank governors and ministers of finance about what you do with carbon assets when they're being held by state-owned enterprises. This is going to be a significant issue for Asia. And then at the same time, I think you are going to see increasing pressure on making sure that green bonds really are green and that they really are asset-backed bonds. And I think you'll see more and more innovation into that space. But I'm not sure that I worry yet about a bubble. But I do think that this is going to be very, very fast moving over the next 2 to 3 years. As another friend of mine who works quite high up in one of the big global banks said to me last week, Rachel, this feels like it's moving at warp speed at the moment. And it's global. This is not just something coming from London, Frankfurt and Wall Street. This is really, I think London is a centre of innovation and creativity, but that is also true in Shanghai, Singapore, and elsewhere.
Thank you. The next question is from Lauren. How do you see the role of multilateral and bilateral financial institutions changing in building resilience to compound crises? And is it fast and/or ambitious enough? What kind of financial mechanisms are needed to better build resilience?
Hi, Lauren. I think that there's a couple of challenges, really. So if we have to speed up the transitions that are already underway, but which need to really leave no one behind, right? So then there's a very, very important role for Bretton Woods institutions, for the development finance institutions, bilateral and multilateral, which means that almost everything that they do has to be ensuring that they're there in a counter-cyclical way at a time of economic crisis like this, but that they're there in a way that really promulgates policy that increases inclusion and which increases decarbonisation, because both of those things are going to be absolutely essential to economic resilience. And if we imagine that this is COVID-19, but that there may be a COVID-21, a COVID-22, a COVID-25, I don't know, and we know that we baked in climate crises at ever escalating ferocity for the next 10 years, and then there's potentially other things that we haven't seen coming, then that economic resilience is going to be fundamental. And so there's a big debate around, well, there should be a re-engaged debate around how low-income countries and middle-income countries are using their tax bases, what they're taxing, how they're investing, how they're stopping capital flight, all of the things that were in the Addis Ababa agenda. And then development aid over the top of that needs to be promulgating more inclusion and decarbonisation. And frankly, I think the conversation has shifted from, you know, how much of your lending is climate positive to you shouldn't be doing anything that isn't building resilience, frankly. So I think that, and I don't think that shift has been made in policy terms. I think that there should be, you know, a real urgent conversation around whether the current mechanisms are good enough, because let's say everybody gets the assistance that they need from the IMF, so that's public budgetary support. That budgetary support can't be used to prop up things which are not going to be competitive over the next 10 years. But so we need that Marshall Plan plus the recovery plan plus the green plan, something, you know, bigger and more extensive than we've ever seen before. And we can, you know, we can start, you know, looking at the very energy intensive economies and what their transitions look like, and looking at different classifications of economies and what their transitions look like. And that's not fly in, fly out development. I mean, nobody's flying anywhere under COVID, but that really is putting in place, you know, sort of teams who are going to be dedicated for a long period of time. And I'm not sure that the current setup of regional development banks and the World Bank sitting in Washington, you know, and, you know, the costs of the transaction costs of collaboration amongst the multilateral institutions, whether that is urgent or fluid enough to work. The second piece of this, I think, is that development finance is sliced and diced into, you know, 1,000 little tiny pieces, and the watchword over the last 20 years is every time a new problem was defined, you would set up a new fund or a new facility or a new trust fund or a new mechanism. And when I talk to developing countries and I advise a couple of them, when you look at it from their perspective, this is just, the transaction cost is too high. All of the bells and whistles are designed to protect the person who's lending you money, not to protect you. And if we're asking countries to really turn on a dime at a moment of pivot, then I wonder whether or not we need to be a little bit bolder in our acceptance of risk when we're giving development finance out. And that is not to say that we should repeat the problems of 30 years ago and go back into a world where, you know, development aid was corruptly repurposed and things like that. But I do think we need larger pools of more flexible capital on the back of well-constructed plans that countries bring forward. And I'm not sure that that's quite yet where we are. So I think there are some redesign opportunities to make funding flow in a more ambitious way.
Great. The next question is, what are some of the ways in which civil society and non-governmental organizations can participate in and push for the energy transition, particularly in countries and contexts where there is a real resistance to the climate science and denial of its impacts?
Well, so thanks for the question. I mean, what I see is that you know, even in a country where climate denial has found roots in the political system or in the governance, communities normally know full well what's going on, right? I mean, the most acute climate observers are farmers, followed by community health nurses, followed by anybody else that's sort of working, you know, close to nature and people. And so, you know, we know what air quality is doing to health. We know what exposure to methane emissions does to health, and we know what the changing weather is doing to crop yield and performance. And so what I think is that even in the countries where you've got climate denial cemented in political leadership at the national level, that's not stopping local communities, it's not stopping local leaders, and it's not stopping local businesses from doing what they need to and from actually knowing what they need. I think what it does do is, you know, take away the lift that could come from national campaigns or national targets. You know, a rising tide could lift all boats. If we look at the United States, no matter the positions that are taken in Washington through America's Pledge, which was launched after the current president announced that he would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, through America's Pledge, you're seeing extraordinary innovation, commitment to aggressive carbon targets. I mean, here in Massachusetts has got a net zero commitment. The Mayor Walsh of Boston has got extremely aggressive commitments for Boston, and so do a lot of the local mayors as well. So would it be easier if the whole country was sort of signed up to this? Yes, but I don't think it's you know, without it, a lot can still happen. In emerging markets, I think access to the new decentralized renewable energy technologies, for example, in very poor communities, often it is women within the community that want to have access to that technology because they're worried about what's going on in the household. They're also trying to set up home-based businesses, or they're trying to grow a business within the village or the town. I think it's clear that COVID has disrupted blended finance into that space. And I was part of a launch last week of a grant fund, which is basically a distress fund for small-scale renewable energy entrepreneurs across Africa and South Asia who are experiencing significant problems being able to continue to access capital. But I think that they're you know, these are the kinds of things that can happen even when maybe the leadership is not fully on board.
Okay, we only have time for one more. We have a couple of minutes. So this last question is, you've spoken mostly about top-down policy ideas, but what about the bottom-up, the grassroots level? What can be done to make the consumer more aware of their carbon footprint and the carbon footprint of the brands and products they buy?
So thank you for the question. So bottom up, you should have, you know, we can do things like, and this would be, and you can see this in certain recovery packages. So, you know, in order of sort of significance, well, again, depending on where you are in the world and what kind of society you're living in, but the energy efficiency of the house that you live in, and being able to improve that has a huge bang for the buck. Being able to access community biodigestion and community composting and ending food waste both in your house and in your community has a significant impact. So these are things that you can take individual action towards. But these are also things that you can demand from your local authority and your regional governments, as it were. And I think that it's important for individuals to know what they can do and what will have an impact. But, you know, the curve, I mean, I didn't show the graphs that show the complete drop off in emissions immediately that the world started locking down in March, right? And we actually saw curves that were precipitous. And then we've seen, as the world started to try to open up again, we've seen those emissions come all the way back up almost. And that shows you that it isn't about individual action alone, it is about the systems. And the emissions are baked into the systems that we are locked into. And so when I speak to young people, I talk about the other local action, which is vote. You know, who do you vote in as your selectman here in Massachusetts? Who do you vote in as your mayor? Who do you vote in as your regional leader? And who do you vote in to lead the economy in countries where you can vote? Right? So this is going to be the most important because it's going to be those system resets. So it's going to be the efficiency targets of what you expect to get out of your national grid. It's going to be about the investment decisions that you make for new sources of installed energy capacity. It's going to be about making big bets on energy storage and making the right choices there. It's going to be about having the national debate about whether or not you are comfortable as a society with risks for new forms of nuclear energy. These are the big discussions that we need to be having, and they are system discussions. But in the meantime, if you can get access to affordable and healthy food, great, don't waste it. If you can refurbish your house, great, and if you can get a grant or a loan to do that, even better. These are where the big parts of your carbon footprint come from. I assume you're not flying at the moment. We can have another seminar on the future of the aviation industry. And then obviously ground transportation. But there are big news items going to come in the next few weeks on trucks and the trucking industry's capacity to end its use of the internal combustion engine. There'll be more announcements coming out of the way in which we can get to zero carbon-free vessels and shipping by 2030, 2035, or the leading edge of that by then. And obviously, there continue to be announcements about hydrogen aircraft and electric aircraft, and you will see, I think, innovation over the next 30 to 40 years in that space too. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dean Kyte. This was a wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for participating. Just a quick reminder for Fletcher alums, we will be doing another talk with Dean Kyte starting at 5 after the hour. You should have a separate link to that, so you'll need to log out of this meeting and then log into that one. So we look forward to seeing you there, and thank you everyone for participating. Have a great day. Night.
Thank you very much.